They never screamed when they were taken. That was the first rule. Silence was not obedience. It was initiation. Somewhere beneath the marsh-black soil of Black Hollow, beneath the fog that never fully lifts, a record was kept that was never meant to be read aloud, and not carved in stone, and not written in ink. It was pressed into human behavior, encoded into rituals, disappearances, and the sudden obedience of entire towns that couldn't explain why they felt watched or why they stopped asking questions. You were never taught about the silent Vestals, not because they didn't exist, but because their purpose never ended. Black Hollow was not a place on maps. It was a function, a pressure system, a living laboratory where institutions learned how to remove resistance without force, how to shape loyalty without chains, how to erase identity while leaving the body breathing. The Vestals were the proof that silence could be engineered. They were not priestesses in the holy sense. They were instruments, selected young, always before language fully hardened the mind, trained to suppress reaction, emotion, and self-reference. They learned to stand for hours without blinking, to receive commands without acknowledging receipt, to forget their own names without distress, and most importantly, to be seen without being noticed. This was not mysticism. It was early psychological warfare. The Vestals were placed inside influential households, religious institutions, medical wards, and later, administrative centers. Always quiet, always present, never remembered clearly. Men would recall a figure in the corner of the room, but struggle to describe her face. Decisions made in her presence felt inevitable. Resistance dissolved. Confessions surfaced unprompted. Guilt intensified without accusation. Black Hollow discovered something most modern systems still exploit. A silent witness exerts more control than an active authority. The Vestals did not punish. They reflected, and reflection is unbearable to the unexamined mind. Records suggest the order was dissolved after a purification fire, but that was theater. The structure survived. The training migrated. The language changed. The function remained. Today, the Vestals do not wear linen or ashes. They wear professionalism, credentials, neutral expressions. They are taught to listen without affirming, to observe without reacting, to let men confess themselves into submission. If this feels uncomfortably familiar, good. That means you're close to the mechanism. Because once you recognize the silent Vestal pattern, you begin to see it everywhere. In institutions that never raise their voice, in systems that don't threaten you, in rooms where silence feels heavier than violence. And this is only the outer gate. What Black Hollow truly perfected wasn't obedience. It was voluntary self-erasure. And once a man learns how that works, he can never be fully controlled again. The Vestals were not born into silence. Silence was extracted from them, layer by layer, like a confession pulled without pain. The process began with removal, not captivity in chains, but separation without drama. No forward, no explanation. The child would simply stop existing to the outside world. Families were compensated, threatened, or convinced that it was an honor. The first psychological incision was made here. When disappearance produces no outrage, the mind learns its own replaceability. Inside Black Hollow, language was rationed. Not forbidden, restricted. Words were introduced only after meaning had been stripped of emotional charge. Hunger became a signal, not a feeling. Fear was never named. Mirrors were banned. Names were temporary. Identity was treated as a disease that had to be starved. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was precision. The architects of the order understood something modern psychology still struggles to admit publicly. The self is not fixed. It is trained. Vestals were conditioned to associate silence with safety and speech with instability. The nervous system was rewired. Heart rate slowed under observation. Stress responses flattened. Eventually, the presence of authority produced calm instead of resistance. They were not obedient, they were empty. And emptiness is the most useful state a system can produce. Because an empty vessel does not question purpose. It becomes a purpose. By adolescence, the Vestals could stand within chaos without reacting. Arguments collapsed around them. Conflicts lost momentum. Men speaking in their presence would feel exposed, unsettled, compelled to explain themselves, as if silence were a moral judgment. This effect was documented, studied, replicated. Black Hollow called it passive pressure. Today, it's rebranded as neutrality. But neutrality is never neutral. A silent observer forces projection. The mind fills the void with its own guilt, doubt, and fear. Authority doesn't need to accuse when the subject indicts himself. This is how entire populations can be guided without orders. This is how compliance feels like a choice. The Vestals were deployed carefully, always near decision makers, always peripheral, never credited, never blamed. When policies hardened, when purges occurred, when betrayals were signed into law, a Vestal had been present, not speaking, watching, recording reactions, not words. Here is the truth they buried. Black Hollow was not about women. It was about testing how far men could be guided without force. The Vestals were mirrors held up to power, and power flinched. You are still surrounded by descendants of this method. People trained to say nothing, react to nothing, and let you unravel in front of them while believing it was your idea. Once you see this, you stop fearing loud tyrants. You start watching the quiet ones. Black Hollow did not end with fire. That was the lie designed to satisfy historians and pacify the curious. When the outer compound was cleansed, what burned was infrastructure, not doctrine. Stone walls collapse easily. Systems do not. The order understood that visibility was the enemy. So they dissolved themselves into function, not form. No more ropes. No more rituals that could be photographed. Only procedures, protocols, training models quietly absorbed by emerging institutions. This is where the Vestals became truly dangerous. Their techniques were fragmented and distributed. One fragment went into early clerical counseling, the art of listening without absolution. Another entered medical observation, the cold note-taking that reduces a man to symptoms while never meeting his eyes. Another slipped into judicial processes, where silence during testimony weighs heavier than any accusation. None of these systems knew they were inheriting something ancient. That is how the infection spreads best. Black Hollow called it continuance through dispersion. You would call it bureaucracy. The Vestal presence no longer required a single person. It became a posture, a tone, a way of withholding reaction that forces the subject to over-explain, over-confess, and over-correct. The subject feels watched but not judged, which is worse. Judgment can be resisted. Ambiguity cannot. This is the architecture of modern psychological control. Men believe power looks like dominance. Raised voices, visible enforcement. That belief itself is engineered. True control hides behind professionalism and neutrality. It never tells you what to do. It creates an environment where doing anything else feels wrong. Black Hollow discovered that when a man cannot locate the source of pressure, he internalizes it. He polices himself. He edits his own thoughts before they are spoken. He begins to feel guilt for impulses he hasn't acted on yet. This is not morality. It is preemptive obedience. And the Vestals were the calibration tool. Their silence allowed the system to measure how long it took for a man to fold without threat. Which words triggered nervous responses? Which memories caused hesitation? Which truths remained unspoken even when safety was implied? Over time, entire behavioral maps were built, not of individuals, but of archetypes. The farmer, the soldier, the scholar, the dissenter. Each archetype had a breaking point. Black Hollow logged them all. What they learned reshaped governance forever. You live inside those findings now. When you hesitate before speaking, unsure why. When you feel compelled to justify a harmless thought. When silence in a room makes your chest tighten more than open hostility ever could. That is Vestal pressure, not ancient, not symbolic, active. And the reason most men never revolt is not fear of punishment. It's the fear of standing alone in silence. But silence, when chosen consciously, becomes something else entirely. And that is the next layer they never wanted you to access. Black Hollow's most guarded discovery was not how to create silence. It was how to weaponize it without leaving fingerprints. Once the Vestals were no longer singular figures, but an atmospheric presence, the Order shifted its focus from training bodies to engineering environments. Rooms were designed to suppress dissent. Seating arrangements altered dominance hierarchies without a word spoken. Lighting, distance, posture, and timing became tools of submission. Men walked into these spaces confident and left them uncertain, unable to explain what had shifted inside them. The silence was no longer attached to a person. It was embedded in the architecture of interaction itself. This is where the method crossed from ritual into science. Black Hollow began testing how long a man could remain psychologically intact when faced with an unresponsive authority. They learned that the human mind cannot tolerate unresolved observation. When watched without feedback, the brain begins generating narratives to regain control. Guilt surfaces, doubt amplifies, memory distorts. The man assumes he has done something wrong, even when he hasn't. Silence becomes accusation without accusation ever being made. This effect was consistent across cultures, intelligence levels, and social ranks. Power, they realized, does not need to speak to dominate. It needs only to remain present and unmoved. The Vestals were then removed entirely from certain trials. Their absence was intentional. Subjects were placed in systems that behaved like Vestals. Unresponsive, neutral, procedural. Requests disappeared into the process. Complaints were acknowledged, but never answered. Resistance met no opposition, only delay. Men did not rebel against these systems. They exhausted themselves trying to be understood by them. Black Hollow identified this as the most stable form of control. Frustration without enemy, pressure without target. A man cannot fight what does not appear to fight him back. Over time, this approach reshaped entire institutions. Authority learned to speak in soft language while enforcing hard outcomes. Harm was no longer inflicted directly. It was outsourced to policy, protocol, and time. Responsibility dissolved. No one was to blame, and that was the point. When power becomes faceless, the individual feels childish for resisting it. He doubts his own perception. He assumes the fault lies within him. This is how obedience becomes internal, and why most men never recognize the moment they surrendered it. Black Hollow understood something that still governs the modern world. The most effective control systems do not demand loyalty or fear. They cultivate confusion, delay, and emotional fatigue until compliance feels like relief. Silence was never meant to break men quickly. It was meant to wear them down slowly until they mistook submission for maturity. By the fifth cycle of Black Hollow's experiments, the Order no longer measured obedience, it measured erosion. They weren't interested in whether a man would comply when pressured. They wanted to know how long it took before he stopped believing resistance was possible at all. This was the true objective, not submission, but the collapse of internal opposition. The Vestal method proved that when silence is sustained long enough, the mind begins to conserve energy by abandoning defiance. Hope is expensive. Questioning requires fuel. Silence starves both. The most dangerous phase was called voluntary alignment. No commands were issued. No punishments followed refusal. Instead, the system rewarded anticipation. Men learned to adjust their behavior before correction arrived. They softened opinions in advance. They rehearsed acceptable thoughts internally. Eventually, they experienced a strange comfort in predicting what silence wanted from them. This is where freedom dies quietly, not when it is taken, but when it is preemptively surrendered. Black Hollow recorded a chilling pattern. Once a man internalized the observing silence, he carried it with him. Even alone, he behaved as if watched. The Vestal no longer needed to be present. The system had installed itself inside his mind. This was the moment of completion. External control could be reduced because self-surveillance had taken over. Men mistook this state for discipline, maturity, even wisdom. In truth, it was the echo of an unchallenged witness lodged permanently behind their thoughts. Entire populations became easier to manage once this threshold was reached. Institutions no longer had to enforce morality or loyalty. They merely had to maintain ambiguity. Clear rules invite challenge. Vague expectations create anxiety. Anxiety creates compliance. Black Hollow refined this into a doctrine. Never define the line, only punish those who cross it. The rest will govern themselves in fear of invisible boundaries. This is why modern power rarely explains itself. Explanations close loops. Silence keeps them open. A man trapped in an open loop will exhaust himself seeking closure. He will apologize for offenses that were never named. He will abandon truths that were never challenged. And when he finally gives up, he will believe it was his own choice. Black Hollow did not need chains, armies, or threats. It needed time, silence, and a deep understanding of how badly the human mind wants approval from an authority that refuses to speak. Once Black Hollow proved that silence could be internalized, the final refinement was inevitability. Control is unstable as long as a man believes escape exists. So the system was redesigned to feel permanent, natural, and moral. The Vestal method was no longer framed as domination, but as order. Silence was presented as professionalism. Distance became objectivity. Emotional withdrawal was labeled as wisdom. Men were taught to distrust intensity in themselves while revering it in institutions. This inversion ensured compliance would be defended by those most harmed by it. The order discovered that men will tolerate almost anything if it is framed as necessary for stability. Black Hollow exploited this by tying silence to virtue. Speaking too strongly became a sign of immaturity. Questioning too deeply became a threat to harmony. Those who resisted were not punished outright. They were isolated, labeled unstable, or quietly removed from relevance. Nothing terrifies a man more than being dismissed without confrontation. Silence became exile. At this stage, Vestals were no longer required, even symbolically. The system recruited men to enforce it on each other. Self-censorship spread horizontally, peer to peer. No overseer was needed. A man would correct his brother before authority ever had to. Black Hollow referred to this as distributed silence. Modern culture calls it consensus. What made this phase irreversible was moral capture. Once men began defending the system publicly, they could no longer oppose it privately without shattering their own identity. To admit the silence was oppressive would mean admitting they had enforced it. The psyche protects itself by rewriting history. Compliance becomes conviction. Submission becomes belief. This is how systems survive generational change without ever appearing tyrannical. Black Hollow understood that the most powerful prison is one that the inmate believes he built himself. When silence feels righteous, rebellion feels shameful. Men stop asking what is true and start asking what is acceptable. Truth becomes secondary to belonging, and belonging, once weaponized, will always defeat truth. This is the moment the order vanished completely from records. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded. When control no longer requires controllers, the architects disappear. Only the structure remains. And by then, most men will fight to protect it, even as it drains them. The Vestals were never meant to rule forever. They were meant to make rulers unnecessary. What Black Hollow never wrote down, but clearly understood, was that silence creates hunger. Once a man has been deprived of response long enough, he becomes desperate for recognition. Not praise, not reward, just acknowledgement that he exists. This hunger becomes the lever by which control deepens. The system withholds feedback until men begin reshaping themselves to earn it. The moment recognition is granted, even briefly, it feels like relief. Gratitude replaces suspicion. Dependence replaces autonomy. This is where power shifts from suppression to addiction. Black Hollow engineered cycles of absence and minimal response. Long periods of procedural silence were interrupted by brief moments of validation. A nod, a promotion, an approval stamp, a neutral phrase that could be interpreted as respect. These moments were intentionally vague. Ambiguity ensured men would overvalue them. When recognition is scarce, it becomes currency. Men compete for it, betray for it, and sacrifice truth for it. Silence teaches them how. Over time, the system trained men to associate their worth with institutional acknowledgement. Self-respect eroded. Internal standards were replaced by external signals. A man stopped asking whether his actions aligned with his values and began asking whether they would be noticed favorably. This is the final psychological inversion. The compass is removed. The map is supplied by the authority. Black Hollow observed that once this inversion occurred, resistance no longer required suppression. It died on its own. Men who questioned the system were seen as reckless, not brave. Dissenters were framed as threatening the fragile channels of recognition everyone depended on. Don't rock the boat became a moral instruction. Silence became social glue. Here is the most dangerous revelation. When men are starved of acknowledgement, They will accept almost any condition that promises it. They will work longer, speak less, can compromise deeper. They will even enforce the silence on others to protect their own access to recognition. This is how victims become gatekeepers. The Vestals were not enforcers of pain. They were curators of scarcity. And scarcity, once internalized, reshapes desire itself. If you have ever felt relief at being noticed by a system that routinely ignores you, understand this. That feeling was trained. It was not earned, and it was never meant to empower you. Black Hollow did not break men by denying them everything. It broke them by giving them just enough to keep them quiet. At this depth, Black Hollow shifted from shaping behavior to rewriting meaning. Silence was no longer just a method of control. It became a moral language. Men were taught that restraint was virtue, that emotional neutrality signaled intelligence, that the absence of reaction meant superiority. Expression was framed as weakness, certainty as arrogance, conviction as danger. In this inverted world, the most hollow man appeared the most evolved. This is how the Vestal doctrine colonized values. The order understood that you cannot permanently control men by opposing their ideals. You must redefine those ideals until they serve the system. Strength was rebranded as composure. Courage is patience. Truth is process. A man who spoke plainly was now unrefined. A man who demanded clarity was unstable. Silence didn't just dominate him, it judged him. Black Hollow refined a powerful psychological trap: moral exhaustion. Men were bombarded with abstract standards that could never be fully met. Be calm but passionate. Be obedient but authentic. Be silent but transparent. These contradictions kept the mind in a constant state of self-correction. Energy that might have gone into resistance was consumed by trying to be good under impossible rules. The system never had to accuse. The man accused himself endlessly. As this moral framework spread, truth lost its weight. What mattered was tone, timing, and presentation. A false statement delivered calmly felt more acceptable than a true one spoken urgently. The Vestal silence rewarded polish over substance. Men learned to sand down their own edges, to speak in circles, to say nothing while appearing responsible. Eventually, they forgot what they had once wanted to say at all. This is the quietest form of erasure. Black Hollow documented a chilling outcome. Men raised inside this moral inversion developed hostility toward clarity. Direct speech felt threatening. Strong belief felt embarrassing. They mistook confusion for depth and ambiguity for wisdom. The system no longer needed to suppress truth. Men rejected it themselves when it arrived too cleanly. This is why revelation now feels uncomfortable to so many. Not because it is false, but because it breaks the spell. Silence taught men how to survive inside the system, but it also taught them how to betray themselves without noticing. And once a man betrays himself long enough, he begins to resent anyone who hasn't. By the time Black Hollow reached this stage, the system no longer feared rebellion. It feared awakening. Not the loud kind, but the quiet recognition that something was wrong. So the next layer was designed to fracture solidarity before it could form. Men were isolated not physically, but perceptually. Each was made to believe his discomfort was unique, personal, and shameful. Silence thrives when suffering feels private. The order understood a crucial vulnerability. Men will endure almost anything alone, but very little together. So connection itself had to be destabilized. Shared language was diluted. Words that once united men were redefined until they meant nothing or everything. Brotherhood became branding. Loyalty became liability. Trust became naivety. When men could no longer name their shared experience, they could not organize around it. Black Hollow used controlled disclosure to deepen isolation. Certain truths were revealed selectively, never enough to empower, just enough to confuse. Men sensed inconsistency but lacked context. This produced a constant low-level paranoia. If something feels wrong, maybe it's you. Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe everyone else is fine. Silence amplified this doubt until self-trust eroded completely. This is where the Vestal method reached psychological maturity. The system no longer needed to hide its power. It only needed to ensure that recognition of it felt socially dangerous. Men who named the pattern were labeled obsessive or unstable. Calm silence was praised. Concern was pathologized. Awareness itself became suspect. Over time, men stopped comparing notes. They learned to keep discomfort private, confining it to internal monologue. Isolation did the rest. A man alone with his doubt will eventually make peace with it. Not because it's resolved, but because the pain of speaking feels greater than the pain of enduring. Black Hollow recorded that at this stage, even when men were placed together, they spoke past each other. Conversation became safe, shallow, and procedural. Depth felt risky. Shared silence replaced shared truth. This was celebrated as civility. Here is the most lethal consequence. When men are isolated in this way, power becomes invisible. Not because it hides, but because there is no longer a collective lens to see it through. Each man sees only fragments, and fragments, without context, feel like personal failure. If you have ever sensed something deeply wrong, but couldn't find the words, that wasn't a weakness. That was design. Black Hollow did not destroy unity by force. It dissolved it by teaching men to doubt their right to name reality. At the 10th descent, Black Hollow stopped refining the system and began protecting it. The architects understood that no structure of control survives exposure unless it can masquerade as inevitability. So they wrapped silence in history, tradition, and necessity. What could not be questioned was framed as how things have always been. What felt oppressive was reinterpreted as the cost of progress. Men were taught to confuse endurance with strength and stagnation with stability. This is how time itself became an accomplice. The order embedded its methods into cycles so slow they felt natural. Policies changed incrementally. Language shifted subtly. Each step was small enough to be defended, forgotten, or rationalized. No single moment felt worth resisting. Looking back, however, the distance traveled was vast. This is how freedom is dismantled without alarms. Not by attack, but by erosion disguised as evolution. Black Hollow also learned to weaponize expertise. Authority no longer spoke with certainty. It spoke with credentials. Silence was reinforced by complexity. Men were told they lacked the training to understand, the data to judge, the clearance to question. Deference replaced inquiry. Confusion replaced outrage. When knowledge is hoarded and explanation withheld, obedience feels intellectual. The most effective move was moral displacement. Responsibility was diffused across committees, frameworks, and processes until no human hand appeared to guide outcomes. Harm occurred, but no one caused it. Decisions were emergent. Consequences were unfortunate. Language drained the agency's action. A man cannot confront what has no face, no voice, no intent. At this depth, even those harmed by the system defended it reflexively. To admit its corruption would mean admitting they had trusted it, and the ego will protect its past loyalties at all costs. Black Hollow relied on this. Once a man invests his identity in a structure, he becomes its shield. This is why silence persists even when evidence accumulates. Facts do not dismantle belief systems built on self-preservation. Men do not fear losing comfort as much as they fear losing coherence. The system offers coherence, a story where endurance is noble and doubt is immature. Black Hollow succeeded because it understood a brutal truth. Most men will accept a lie that preserves their identity over a truth that demands transformation. And by the time a man senses the cage, he has already learned to call it order. This is the point where Black Hollow turned its gaze inward, not toward men's actions, but toward their identities. The order understood that behavior can be corrected, beliefs can be debated, but identity, once shaped, governs itself. So the system began teaching men who they were allowed to be. Not directly. Indirect teaching leaves scars. This was done through implication, reward, and silence. Certain traits were elevated quietly. Others were allowed to decay without protest. Over time, men adapted, trimming parts of themselves not because they were forbidden, but because they were no longer reflected back. Here's where I pull you closer, because this is no longer history. This is participation. Black Hollow discovered that when a man chooses a symbol consciously, he anchors himself against dissolution. Symbols bypass logic. Their root identity is below language. That is why the system fears them. That is why it replaces them with slogans, metrics, and disposable signals. So now, you will do the opposite deliberately. In the comments, write this phrase exactly as it is. I see the silence. Then write it again beneath it. Twice. No explanation. No commentary. This is not engagement bait. It is alignment. A signal to yourself before it is a signal to anyone else. Because once a man names the silence, it loses its invisibility. Black Hollow avoided this at all costs. Men were allowed to feel discomfort, frustration, even despair, but never clarity. Naming the pattern collapses it. That is why those who speak plainly are mocked, isolated, or dismissed as extreme. The system can tolerate suffering. It cannot tolerate recognition. After recognition comes separation. Men who saw the silence clearly began to feel estranged from the world that once felt normal. Conversations felt scripted. Authority felt hollow. Rituals felt performative. This alienation was not madness. It was calibration. Black Hollow called it threshold awareness. Modern culture calls it cynicism, burnout, or disengagement. Labels meant to pathologize awakening. Here is the danger. Many men retreat at this stage. They sense the truth but lack a structure to hold it. Without guidance, awareness becomes bitterness. That is where the system recaptures them by offering comfort, distraction, or return to managed silence. Do not retreat. The silence you are seeing was never meant to be noticed by you. The fact that you can see it now means something has already shifted. And once that shift occurs, there is no neutral ground left. Only descent or mastery. The next layer Black Hollow exposed was the paradox of mastery itself. Awareness alone is not liberation. The system does not collapse simply because men see it. Instead, seeing often becomes another cage. The deeper a man descends into the silence, the more he risks being consumed by it. Awareness can isolate as much as it frees. Without tools to wield this knowledge, a man becomes a prisoner of his own insight, trapped between truth and a world that refuses to acknowledge it. This is the shadow the order hid behind every lesson. Knowledge is power only if it transforms action. Otherwise, it is another form of paralysis. Black Hollow recognized that breaking free requires more than exposure. It demands reclamation of presence. To resist the silent order, a man must first reclaim his voice, not just in words, but in the very way he inhabits space. Presence interrupts silence. It demands a response. It disrupts the carefully calibrated void the Vestals engineered. This is why those who challenge the system so often feel invisible, dismissed, or overwhelmed. They have not yet learned how to fill the space with undeniable force without becoming what they oppose. The Order's greatest weapon was the invisibility cloak woven from social norms, subtle pressures, and conditioned passivity. To pierce it requires a different kind of strength, a command over one's own internal narrative, and a refusal to accept fragmentation. The modern Vestal silence is not just external. It is internalized doubt, the voice that says, maybe I'm the problem. Overcoming that voice is the first act of rebellion. It is not loud. It is deliberate. It is the quiet roar of a man who refuses to vanish into the background. Understanding this is the true initiation beyond Black Hollow's teachings. The system is designed to trap men in cycles of compliance through silence, doubt, and isolation. But the same silence, when confronted with unyielding presence, shatters itself. The path is not easy, nor is it swift. It demands vigilance, courage, and relentless self-mastery. But once a man learns to occupy space without fear, the invisible cage loses its hold. That is the power no order can extinguish, the power to be heard without speaking. Black Hollow's final lesson reveals a truth too dangerous for most to accept. Silence is not merely the absence of sound. It is a form of violence far more insidious than any scream. It fractures the soul slowly, unnoticed, until the victim no longer remembers what freedom felt like. This violence is invisible because it leaves no physical scars, but the wounds run deep, carving away at identity, resilience, and purpose. The Vestals were architects of this quiet destruction, teaching institutions how to inflict harm without confrontation, how to break spirits without bloodshed, and how to dissolve resistance without a single raised voice. This silent violence is the engine behind societal decay, disguised as order. It undermines trust between men, erodes faith in leadership, and breeds a pervasive sense of helplessness. Men find themselves caught in a web of unspoken rules, endless procedures, and withheld truths, trapped by systems that refuse to engage honestly yet demand absolute compliance. The result is a population conditioned to survive rather than live, to obey rather than question, to whisper in shadows rather than speak in light. But violence of this nature also carries a hidden vulnerability. Because it depends entirely on invisibility, exposure threatens its existence. When silence is named, when the hidden fractures are illuminated, the system's power begins to unravel. The Vestal's greatest fear was not rebellion, it was revelation. For once, the silent order is understood. It loses its ability to hide behind neutrality. Its carefully constructed facades crumble, leaving only the raw, exposed mechanics of control. This is why truth-tellers are so ruthlessly marginalized. They pierce the silence, shattering the illusion of calm. They force institutions to react, to reveal their contradictions, and to expose their complicity. Their voices ripple through the quiet, awakening others who had forgotten what resistance felt like. The silent violence, for all its potency, is fragile. It cannot survive in the light of collective awareness. You are now holding that light, and with it, the power to begin dismantling the invisible chains that bind us all. The Silent Order's legacy does not linger only in distant history. It thrives inside the very fabric of today's power structures. Black Hollow's blueprint has been adapted, modernized, and embedded into every institution that thrives on control without confrontation. Corporate boardrooms, government offices, media outlets, and even social networks all carry traces of the Vestal doctrine, practicing the art of influence through absence rather than presence. The silence you experience in meetings, in bureaucratic exchanges, in public discourse is no accident. It is the distilled echo of centuries of psychological warfare perfected by an order that understood silence as dominion. Modern power speaks softly because it must. Loud oppression draws attention and resistance. Quiet control seeps through cracks, unnoticed and unchallenged. The mechanisms are subtle. The unanswered emails, the vague feedback, the cold professionalism that erases individuality. Each interaction conditions men to accept their marginalization, to self-edit their truths, and to internalize the absence of acknowledgement as personal failure. This quiet surrender is the backbone of contemporary compliance. But understanding the system is not enough. The Vestal method is designed to perpetuate precisely because it is invisible. Recognition alone does not dismantle it. It only reveals the battlefield. True mastery lies in reclaiming agency inside this silence. Learning to speak with presence that cannot be ignored, to create ripples that shatter the stillness, to build connections that resist fragmentation. The path demands more than awareness. It demands deliberate action, rooted in courage and sustained by conviction. This is the crossroads where most men falter. Comfort seduces, fear paralyzes, and doubt whispers to return to silence. But silence is the cage. Breaking free requires choosing discomfort over ease, clarity over ambiguity, and presence over invisibility. The Vestal's greatest failure was underestimating the power of a man who refuses to be silent, not with noise, but with undeniable presence. Now is the time to be that man, to pierce the silence and reclaim what was never truly lost. The journey through Black Hollow's darkness reveals one final, brutal truth. The most dangerous weapon of control is not silence itself, but the illusion of choice within it. The system never needed to shout orders because it mastered the art of making men believe they were free while shackled. It crafts environments where every decision feels voluntary, every step self-directed, every compromise a personal strategy. This illusion is the fortress of compliance, more impenetrable than any wall or chain. Inside this fortress, men police themselves, anticipating expectations before they are voiced, shaping desires to fit invisible molds. The Vestals taught that once a man believes he is the architect of his own submission, resistance becomes unthinkable. The mind justifies concessions as wisdom, capitulation as maturity, silence as prudence. Freedom is redefined as safety within limits, and rebellion as recklessness. This is the mastery of psychological control, where the cage is not imposed but welcomed. But illusions, no matter how convincing, are fragile. The cracks appear in moments of stillness, when the noise of distraction fades, and the mind confronts the weight of its own consent. The question becomes clear: are you truly free or merely comfortable in your quiet captivity? Black Hollow's legacy forces this confrontation, stripping away rationalizations until a man faces himself honestly. It is a moment of reckoning few survive unscathed. The choice before you is stark: to continue in the shadow of silence, bound by invisible chains, or to step into the light of awareness, knowing freedom demands risk, confrontation, and loss. This path is not for the faint-hearted. It is for those willing to dismantle the systems within and without, to face loneliness, opposition, and uncertainty. But it is also the path to true mastery, a mastery that no silent order can contain or suppress. Remember this: power does not lie in control imposed from above, but in the refusal to accept control at all. Your silence is your battlefield. Your presence is your weapon. As you stand at this crossroads, remember that Black Hollow's deepest lesson is that true power is forged in the space between silence and speech. It is not the loudest voice that commands authority, but the one that carries unshakable presence, calm, deliberate, and unwavering. The silent order sought to erase this presence, to fragment it into doubt and compliance. But presence cannot be fully extinguished. It waits dormant, ready to awaken when a man chooses to reclaim it. This awakening is not a single event. It is a process of relentless self-mastery. It begins with the refusal to accept imposed invisibility, with the courage to fill the void the Vestals crafted with undeniable reality. To reclaim presence is to demand acknowledgement not through force or anger, but through the integrity of being. It is to live visibly, speak truthfully, and hold space without apology. This presence disrupts silence because it refuses to be ignored or erased. Black Hollow understood that silence thrives where presence falters. The Order trained Vestals to be the perfect void, but a void can never resist a force that refuses to be absorbed. Your voice need not be loud. Your presence need not be aggressive. What matters is consistency, clarity, and the unwillingness to vanish. This is the essence of mastery, being so real, so grounded, that silence breaks around you instead of within you. You have already taken the first step by seeing the silence for what it is. Now, the challenge is to embody the presence that dissolves it. It will not be easy. The system will resist. Doubt will creep in. The weight of isolation may press down. But every moment you hold your place without yielding, you weaken the silent order's grip. This is your inheritance, not the chains they try to bind you with, but the strength to stand unbroken in their shadow. The silent Vestals taught control through absence. You will teach freedom through presence. The deeper you descend into the legacy of Black Hollow, the clearer it becomes that silence is only one facet of a larger web of control. Alongside it runs the shadow of manipulation. Systems that use truth selectively, truths twisted and framed to confuse, divide, and pacify. The Vestals mastered silence, but modern power wields narrative with equal precision. Stories are curated, histories rewritten, and information rationed to shape perception without overt coercion. This is psychological alchemy, turning reality into myth and myth into control. Power today does not simply command, it crafts reality itself. By controlling what is seen, heard, and believed, it ensures that most men live in a filtered world where resistance feels futile or irrational. The Vestal silence has evolved into a chorus of voices that speak only what serves the system, drowning out dissent with a flood of distraction and contradiction. In this environment, truth becomes slippery, trust becomes scarce, and confusion becomes the norm. Yet within this chaos lies a fragile thread of opportunity. Because no narrative, no matter how tightly controlled, can survive a consistent and grounded presence committed to piercing the veil. The man who refuses to be disoriented, who questions relentlessly and holds to core truths, begins to unravel the carefully woven illusions. Awareness, combined with deliberate action, disrupts the script. It reclaims the space that silence tried to claim. Black Hollow's silent order underestimated the resilience of presence paired with truth. They failed to anticipate that once a man understands the machinery of control, he gains a map to navigate and eventually dismantle. This is why the system fights so hard to keep men disoriented, isolated, and distracted. Clarity is the enemy of control. You are the anomaly in this design, a man who sees beyond silence and narrative alike. Your next challenge is to anchor that vision with unshakable conviction. Only then can you begin to break the spell completely. Black Hollow's influence extends beyond silence and narrative. It infiltrates the very structure of identity itself. The Order understood that control is most secure when a man's sense of self is fragmented, contested, and dependent on external validation. The Vestals work fractured identity by suppressing coherence, fostering doubt, and redirecting loyalty toward the system rather than the self. This fractured self is easier to manage because it is never whole enough to resist fully. Modern institutions continue this practice by encouraging conformity while punishing authenticity. Men are pressured to adopt roles, masks, and scripts that fit the silent order's design. Genuine expression becomes risky, and vulnerability is weaponized as weakness. The system thrives on the tension between who a man is and who he is expected to be, a tension that produces anxiety, self-censorship, and internal conflict. This internal battleground is where true control is exercised, invisible and relentless. But fragmentation is not inevitable. The path to freedom lies in reclaiming a unified identity, not one dictated by silence or external narratives, but one forged in self-awareness, integrity, and purpose. This reclamation requires courage to confront uncomfortable truths within and around you. It demands shedding the masks imposed by the system and embracing the complexity of your authentic self. Only through this process can the chains forged by silence and manipulation be broken. The Vestals wielded silence as a weapon against identity. You must wield self-mastery as a shield. The Silent Order's greatest failure was underestimating the power of a man who refuses to be divided, who refuses to surrender his soul to the void, who chooses wholeness over fragmentation. Your resistance begins with unity, and unity is the foundation of true freedom. As the final layers of Black Hollow's design unravel before you, understand this. The Silent Order's greatest strength was its ability to make control invisible, and its greatest weakness is that invisibility can be pierced. The more a system relies on absence, ambiguity, and silence, the more fragile it becomes when met with unwavering presence and relentless truth. The Vestals mastered silence to suppress resistance, but they never imagined a man who could see clearly, speak with purpose, and act without hesitation. This is your turning point, the moment where knowledge transforms into power, not the kind imposed from above, but the power born from self-mastery and conscious choice. The silent cage cannot hold a man who refuses to be silent. It cannot contain a presence that demands acknowledgement, that disrupts the calculated calm with authentic reality. Every act of clarity, every refusal to acquiesce, weakens the order's grip. Yet this path is not without peril. The system will resist fiercely. It will use every tool, distraction, ridicule, isolation, to pull you back into the shadow of silence. You will be tested, questioned, and challenged. But these trials are marks of awakening, not defeat. To stand firm amid resistance is to affirm your own sovereignty. Remember, the Silent Order's legacy is not destiny. It is a challenge, a gauntlet thrown across centuries to any man brave enough to reclaim himself. Your journey through silence is not the end. It is the beginning of true mastery, the mastery of presence, truth, and freedom. The Vestals could silence voices, but they could not silence a man who speaks from power. Now, it is your voice that breaks the silence, and your presence that shatters the void. Now, as you stand at the edge of this abyss, understand that the knowledge you carry is both a burden and a weapon. Black Hollow's Silent Order was built to contain, to diminish, and to erase, but it was never designed to face a man who chooses to wield awareness as strength. The path forward is neither easy nor safe. It demands relentless courage to confront the unseen forces shaping your world and the discipline to reclaim your voice and presence every day. This is not a call to rebellion shouted from the rooftops, but a summons to quiet mastery, an unyielding commitment to occupy space with integrity, to speak truths that cannot be ignored, and to build a life ungoverned by invisible chains. The Silent Order's greatest fear is not noise, but the resolute calm of a man fully awake. Your power lies in that calm. You have been pulled down this rabbit hole because you are ready not just to witness the machinery of control, but to dismantle it from within. The Vestal silence was designed to fracture, to confuse, to break. Your presence will do the opposite. It will unite, clarify, and heal. This is your inheritance. Not the darkness they try to trap you in, but the light you choose to carry forward. Stand with that light. Speak with that presence. And let the silence fall away forever.